Working. So thank you so much for all of you who are here, for all of you who are going to be joining in later to talk about, to get ourselves ready for the holiday of Passover. And the idea of this class coming together, I know last year I did more of a walking through the Seder and how to make it personally meaningful. This year, my thought was to approach it a little bit differently, to talk about the Exodus and some of the larger themes, or actually one large theme in particular, and then for us to have an opportunity to kind of chat at the end about what might make it the most meaningful for us this Passover that we have ahead. Does that sound good to everyone? Yep. Okay, so then I am going to share a study sheet that I created with all of you. There we go. And basically what I'm doing is just kind of starting with the Exodus story from Parshat Beshalach. And this is at the very, very end of the Israelites being slaves in Egypt. They were just gearing up, living through plague after plague after plague. And finally, after the 10th plague, we know that what happened was that Pharaoh said, okay, get out of here. And the Israelites, of course, they leave, they get ready, they leave from Egypt, and then they find themselves against the Red Sea. And then all of a sudden, Pharaoh changes his mind and sends the army after them. And that's where this Torah portion picks up right here. So as Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites caught sight of the Egyptians advancing upon them. Greatly frightened, the Israelites cried out to Adonai, and they said to Moses, "Was it for want of graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, taking us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt, saying, 'Let us be, and we will serve the Egyptians, for it is better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness?'" And so I want to just pause right there. Why, right at this moment, why do you think this is the reaction that the Israelites have as they're so close to leaving the land of their bondage?
Can you ask that question again? I'm having a hard time trying to get the answer here.
So this is right before the Israelites are freed from Egypt, right? Right before. They've gone on this journey. They finally left. They hear Pharaoh's army in the distance. But as they hear Pharaoh's army in the distance, they start complaining and saying, "Why would you have brought us out of Egypt to begin with?" So why would that be their reaction immediately to turn on Moses like that?
Okay, now I think the unknown is scary. So you don't know where you're going and what you're doing. And even though it was so horrible being a slave, at least maybe you got one meal a day, I don't know. But you knew. I think they're really brave. So I'd be scared.
Yeah. And anything new is really, really scary.
But also, aren't they facing the Red Sea and it hasn't parted? So they see their way blocked and they see the army, they hear it behind them advancing on them. So they thought it was hopeless.
Okay, so maybe they gave up hope immediately. Here they had lived through 10 plagues, 10 miracles that they saw before their very eyes. God promised to be with them. But right at this moment when things are getting tough, they're like, oh no, it's all for naught. We shouldn't have done any of this, right? Like it takes a kind of courage that is difficult to muster in difficult moments. So I want us just to kind of hold on to that at this moment as we go a little bit further in the story, because we, from our perspective, we know it's going to happen. We know what the story ends up becoming, but they didn't know what the next thing would be, right? And so if we go forward with the text, Moses responds to them, trying to calm them down, trying to give them perspective, and says, have no fear. Stand by, witness the deliverance that God will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. Adonai will battle for you. You hold your peace. Then God said to Moses, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. So it's kind of an interesting thing going on here, right? The Israelites are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, quite literally, right? Then Moses' response is, oh, God will fight for you. God's here for you. God will deliver you. Everything is well. And God says, what are you turning to me for? Go do something for yourself. And then God tells Moses what to do. And this is a part of the story we often don't talk about when we're going through the Seder, but it's right here in the Torah, right here in the midst of it, right? So it says, and you lift your rod up and hold out your arm over the sea to split it. That part we talk about, so that the Israelites may march into the sea on dry ground. And I will stiffen the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and his warriors, his chariots and his riders. Let the Egyptians know that I am Adonai, when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots and his riders. The messenger of God, who had been going ahead of the Israelite army, now moved and followed behind them, and the pillar of cloud shifted in front of them and took up a place behind them. And it came between the army of the Egyptians and the army of Israel. Thus there was a cloud with the darkness, and it cast a spell upon the night, so that the one could not come near the other through the night. So God, in essence, God said, no, do something for yourself, but then look at what God is doing, right? And then Moses is holding his arm over the sea, and God drove back the sea with a strong east wind all that night, and it turned the sea into dry ground. The waters were split, and the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground. The waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians came in pursuit of them into the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and riders. And in the morning watch, God looked down upon the Egyptian army from a pillar of fire and cloud and threw the Egyptian army into panic. So look at the timing of all of this, right? It's nighttime when they leave, but this is morning watch, the beginning of the morning, when the waters are about to come down. God locked the wheels of their chariots so that they moved forward with difficulty, and the Egyptians said, let us flee from the Israelites, for God is fighting for them against Egypt. Then God said to Moses, hold out your arm over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians and upon the chariots and upon the riders. So Moses not only uses his rod in order to part the sea, but then uses the rod again in order to have it come down. And Moses held his arm over the sea, and at daybreak, the sea returned to normal state, and the Egyptians fled at its approach. But Adonai hurled the Egyptians into the sea. The waters turned back and covered the chariots and the riders. Pharaoh's entire army that followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the Israelites had marched through the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. So what's really kind of interesting, and what we don't talk about much within our Seders often, is this interplay between God, Moses, and the Israelites. Why does God say, don't turn to me, go into the water? Why does God say that? Right? Like the rabbis ask that question. Like if God is going to have this huge role anyway, why is God saying that? What is the place of that question? And from that question, there's lots of midrashim. There's lots of stories that emerge about what really allowed the waters to part. Within the Torah, we just have this small snippet, right? We have small snippet of God's comment, and then Moses holding up the rod, and then God kind of standing in the way and forming this barrier. But we don't have the piece about what's going on with the Israelites. So actually there's several different midrashim about this, where the Israelites, various tribes are arguing with one another about who will go into the sea first. And one of the more famous midrashim, as you might know, is about Nachshon ben Aminadab from the tribe of Judah. So Rabbi Judah said to Rabbi Meir, "This is not what happened. Rather, this tribe said, I will not be the first to go down into the sea. And this one said, I will not be the first to go down into the sea." So essentially, when God says the words, "What are you looking at me for? Go into the water," the rabbis say, oh, all the tribes were arguing with one another because they knew that their only way to safety was to go through the water, but they were scared to do so. They were scared to wade into the water, to go into unknown territory. They didn't know what would become of them. And so the tribes are arguing with one another. I'm not going first, you go first. And as this argument is taking place, what happens? Nachshon ben Aminadab sprang forward and went first into the sea. And there's lots of different midrashim, I didn't include all of them here, about just the bravery of Nachshon. Some say he's a young boy, some say he's a little bit older, some say he didn't really know how to swim. Some say that as he was going into the water, he said the words of the Shema, and when he came to the last word, the water was going over his head as he was saying it, and only then the waters began to recede. So it takes a lot of bravery in order to actually have the waters part. And I think this is part of what is so important about the story of Exodus and the story of Passover, is just how difficult it is to move forward at times. So I want to bring in just a couple of texts here, talking to what we had in the very first text, where the Israelites are saying, why didn't you bring me out of Egypt again? I could have just stayed there, right? And we have this text where they're asking, like, why did God bring darkness upon the Israelites? Because there were wicked people among the Israelites of the generation who had no desire to leave Egypt. And these died during the 3 days of darkness, so that the Egyptians might not see their destruction and say, these Israelites too have been stricken as we have. So what's going on here? There's this darkness in hopes to kind of bring down the anxiety of the Israelites. They need coaxing. They need pushing in order to leave even a terrible scenario in which babies are being killed, in which they are subjected to really cruel slavery. Even despite all of that, they still aren't ready to leave, right? And this one other text here, in the wilderness, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. This is right after the Exodus, right after they're free. Okay. Oh, I see. Robin wrote something in the chat that God wants the Israelites to be brave and to act on their destiny. God wants them, as they enter the unknown world of the desert, they should go for it. Yeah, God is trying to get them to move, but moving isn't so easy, right? They're resisting it. And so even right after the Exodus, even right here, they just witnessed this miracle. They just became free. And even still, it says in the wilderness, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of God in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, when we ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out of this wilderness to starve this whole congregation to death. So I want us just kind of to pause here of why is it that there is this constant refrain, this constant pushing back that we shouldn't have left Egypt. Here we have a Seder that is all about the miracle of leaving Egypt, and yet the Torah is written in such a way that we are constantly reminded of the Israelites pushing back against that. Why do you think it's like that in the Torah?
Well, maybe to acknowledge what might be construed as human nature, but people don't necessarily trust. They've been slaves for a long time. Maybe they doubt that freedom is really some steps away here. And maybe it's repetitive, the story is repetitive, and this sort of thing to remind us that it is bold, it is audacious to be the first one, to take the first step, the not knowing.
And even when you're not the first one to take the first step.
Yeah, what does it take to be a follower? When you make a decision to follow, that's a big decision also, as well as to lead. And I know there's always a reason when in the Torah stories, when they're repeated like this, there's some importance here that we got to figure out.
Exactly. And here, from our perspective, so many years later, it's so obvious that leaving was the right move. And yet, even here, we have this consistent reminder of how hard that was. So I didn't include a whole lot more texts on here, because really I want us to just be able to have a conversation based on them. But there's one text that comes up in the Seder that felt really appropriate to bring in, which is a question by one of the four sons. Now, I always feel very uncomfortable with this classification of there being an evil son or a bad son, right? But essentially, one of the sons asked the question, what is this worship to you? Why is it so important to you that we celebrate Passover? To you and not to him, as if he's differentiating himself from the Jewish community. And the Haggadah says, since he excluded himself from the collective, he denied a principle of the Jewish faith. And accordingly, you will blunt his teeth and say to him, for the sake of this, did God do for me in my going out of Egypt? For me and not for him. If he had been there, he would not have been saved. So there's something that's really cruel about these comments here, right? And I don't think that there really was this son to whom you would say this to. It's more of a underlining that all of us really are in this together. That this is the story of every single one of us. This isn't something that happened long time ago. This isn't a bedtime story that we tell once a year on Passover. This is something else entirely. It's formative. It's part of our identity. And so for someone to say, I don't want any part of this, is seen as really insulting and really hurtful, because it is innately something, it's not like the tooth fairy. This is something that is just very central to the Jewish people, the formation of the Jewish people. And that brings us to these two other texts that feel really, really important to bring in. One of them is from the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is 1st, 2nd century. And Rabban Gamliel used to say, who does not mention these three things on Passover does not discharge his duty. So during the Passover, there is a long Seder with a specific order to it. We know all that. But in its earliest bare bones stages, the Passover Seder really only required three things. Talking about and telling the story of the Exodus as part of these three things. So one is the Passover offering, which is offered because God passed over the houses of the ancestors in Egypt so that Israelites wouldn't be killed by the 10th plague. The second is unleavened bread, is matzah, which is eaten because our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt and they were able to take this unleavened bread with them before it had a chance to rise when they were leaving Egypt to go forth toward freedom. And the third one, the bitter herb, the maror, which is eaten because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our ancestors in Egypt. But then the text goes on, and this is something that appears in every single Haggadah, at least once. In every generation, A person must regard himself as though he personally had gone out of Egypt. As it is said, and you shall tell your son in that day, saying, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. Therefore, it is our duty to thank, praise, laud, glorify, exalt, honor, bless, extol, and adore God. You know, there were that many synonyms for those phrases, who performed all these miracles for our ancestors and us, who brought us forth from bondage into freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to festivity, from darkness into great light, from servitude into redemption. So the key words here, and you can see again in the Haggadah text below, right, is this obligation to show ourselves as if we personally left Egypt. Why do you think that is the central mitzvah of Passover? And what does it even mean? What does it mean to show ourselves out of Egypt?
Maybe the notion, we have to walk in someone else's shoes to feel what they felt. If this was a story about a person, we might be less likely to identify it. But if we hear that it's about us, then as we tell the story and we identify with us, then we can make it relate to, 2022, if you will, about people who are trying to find freedom and what it's like, and how horrible that can be. So I guess it puts perspective and meaning contemporarily.
So it sounds like you're referring to all the mitzvot around, like, love the stranger for you were once strangers. Yes. You know what it's like to be in this position. So here's your opportunity to really think about that and figure out how to treat others in the way you would have wanted to have been treated.
Yes.
And that's beautiful. That's definitely present in the Haggadah in lots of different ways and can be within our own personal seders. Is there anything else that we think it might mean? Of what does it mean to show ourselves out of the land of Egypt? There's no wrong answers.
Well, if I can jump in, it's a story
hi, Bob.
freedom. It's reminding, sorry I'm late, everyone. It's a story about freedom. It's a story of reminding that we came from slavery and knowing what it's like to have hardships, to know the tragedy we left behind and that it applies to each of us today.
Okay, so when you're talking about tragedies we left behind, how does that apply to each of us today? Can you say just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, if I was leaving Ukraine, that would be a tragedy to leave behind right now, or Russia. I think we face tragedies every day in our lives, and the reason that we put it in is all of us face challenges, homelessness, politicization of people of color that are made to put down, what we do on economic strife. I think Egypt is about enforced slavery of all kinds.
Okay, so here we're talking about a few different things, right? Like, Marla, what you brought up is, we know what it's like to be strangers. This connects us to our history. This connects us to who we are so that we know how to treat others. Bob, you're bringing in kind of slavery that is imposed from the outside on lots of different groups, right. Hardship that is imposed on the outside, and being able to make parallel references from the Seder today, which is similar for what Marla said. You just more pinpointed the external forces that are put on you, right? And at the same time, I'm going to stop sharing just so I can see all of you. There we go. At the same time, there's other types of slavery and bondage as well. There can be slavery and bondage from within. So if you recall at the very beginning, and Bob, I'll reiterate this just really quickly so that you know what we were looking at the beginning, is these early texts in which even as the Israelites are leaving Egypt, even as they are starting their freedom, they are griping and complaining over the hardship that they face and the uncertainty ahead. And the parallel for this is even when we know that what we're doing, the changes that we're making are absolutely the right changes, it doesn't stop us from pushing back against them, because change is really, really hard. And this is kind of where I want to go with our conversation here. Because on Passover, Marla, Bob, you are entirely right. There is opportunity, especially this year, as there are people who are coming into this country, people who are coming into countries all over the place. By the way, I know a young man who is Ukrainian who is looking for a room to sleep in right now. If you know anyone who might have a room to help this young man as he gets started in the San Pedro area, let me know. But there are people really who are struggling quite a lot, and to be able to see these direct parallels with our Seder is really quite profound, right? So to be able to talk about that. Yeah, Bob, please.
What about addiction? Is addiction in Egypt?
I think so. So let me tell you a little bit about the word Egypt, okay? When we think of Egypt, we think the country Egypt in its modern form. We don't know for sure that this story of Passover is entirely factual. In fact, it seems likely that it didn't happen the same way that it's written in the Torah, because the Torah isn't meant to be a history book and never was meant to be a history book. If we look at the word in Hebrew for Egypt, does anyone know what that word is?
Mitzrayim.
Mitzrayim, exactly. Now, Mitzrayim, the root of the word Mitzrayim is tsar. Does anyone know what tsar means? Marla, this seems to be ringing a bell of some sort, right?
The narrow.
Exactly, the narrowness. So what is Egypt really? It's a place of narrowness. It's a place of constriction. If we have an addiction, could be drugs, could be alcohol, could be gambling, could be screens, could be work, could be anything at all, right? If we have an addiction, that addiction is narrowing our ability to live fully and completely. So what is Passover all about? It's about being able to open up our place of narrowness and go to a place of openness. The sea, it was constricted, the path that the Israelites could leave from. But then all of a sudden, it opened up. And in fact, the Hebrew word, rehovot, it begins to open. Rehov, there's room, there's spaciousness. We actually see that within the Torah in the wording that's used. We go from a place of constriction to a place of openness and possibilities. So what is Passover all about? It's about actually pushing us. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's difficult, it's about pushing us out of our assumptions, pushing us out of the patterns we're in that might not be serving us so well, pushing us out of that which is getting in our way. And that could mean addiction, or it could be being in an abusive situation. It could be struggling with mental illness and not getting ourselves the resources that we need in order to help us to get through that, right? Getting to a place of openness might be picking up the phone and saying, hey, this isn't great, help me out, right? Like there's lots of different ways of breaking through to a place of openness. I don't know, is anyone familiar with like the idea of scarcity mindset versus abundance mindset?
I think I've heard of it, yeah.
So basically, like in the 1800s, there was a British man who was talking, I'm trying to remember what his name is, and it's escaping me at the moment, but he was worried that the amount of resources for food on our planet would not be enough to reach the needs of a growing population. And he started talking about something called scarcity. And that's where the idea of scarcity mindset started from. There was a pushing back against that maybe actually that's not the problem. Maybe it's that we're just not thinking outside the box enough about how do we create new resources to make sure that we're meeting other needs. So scarcity mindset versus abundance mindset is about pushing back against the assumptions that we have to see if maybe there's other types of solutions that might be able to reach the goal that is intended. And I think that's a lot of what Passover is all about. Any thoughts on that? It's okay to fight me on it.
I was going back to the notion of the narrowness and the pushing that you mentioned. So then I thought about childbirth in humans and animals. There's the narrowness, and it's the mother, God, pushing. But then I think, you know, I remember observing my sister deliver her babies, and she pushing so hard, and then the next minute she was grabbing them. You know, she had twins, and then the other one was, it's bringing them to her. And then of course that's what a parent does for the rest of their lives if they're a parent, you know, is that push and pull. You keep them close to you. You know, you don't let them roller skate too soon, and then you push them out the door too. And that's what the Israelites must have. I mean, certainly they didn't know about it, but that's what you experience. You get pushed out, and then you have to figure out how to manage this thing.
Yeah.
And so I don't know where I'm going. But
No, I think you're absolutely right, though. There is a push and pull, just like in the story of the Exodus, where all the people are saying, I don't know what to do. I just want to go back to Egypt. Moses is saying, don't worry, God will come in and will help you. And God's saying, time for you to start acting for yourself, right? There's like this push and pull dynamic that's going on all at the same time. And with the Passover Seder too, there is this constant push and pull, right? So the Seder, the word Seder means order. It is a Seder of absolute order. You do this first, then this, then this, then this, then this. You have to hit all the points in order for it to be a Seder. That's just how it is. 4 cups of wine, this, 4 questions, for this, for that. And yet at the same time, what's one of the questions that we ask over and over again on Passover? Why is this night different from all other nights? It is this push and pull. It's order, but it's breaking through order at the same time.
So I was trying to make it match up with the question that you really asked, which was this notion of scarcity and abundance. Trying to put that together.
So let me give you a few more context things with the Passover Seder that might be helpful, right? So in Israelite society at this point, right? Like this is almost 2,000 years ago that we're talking, right? There were people who were slaves, not slaves in the, American slave sort of way. It was different than that, but there are people who served as slaves, and they were in a different class than the people who, owned them essentially, right? And yet on Passover, there's this whole text in the Talmud that says that on Passover, there's no such thing as a slave. Invite your slave. So there was this one slave of Rabbi Gamliel. His name was Tavi, and he was invited to the table to take part in the Seder. So it's saying, some parts of order of our everyday life, we shouldn't be necessarily keeping on Passover. And why was that? Because Tavi said, isn't Passover all about freedom? And yet, here I am as a slave, right? It was a push and pull. It was an opportunity to push back at things in society that actually weren't living up to our highest values. And there it is right in our tradition in black and white, right? This pushing back against society. Now, did slaves still exist for a while after that? Yes, absolutely. But I think it was start of a change in mindset because Passover afforded that possibility. Passover also, if we look at the Seder, it is actually based on the, it's based on the Greek symposium. It's based on this idea of sitting down, having food, having tapas, dipping things. All of those were actually Greek customs that the Jewish people took on in order to celebrate this holiday. So it's kind of a bringing in other cultures in order as a formative way of leaning into our own.
Hi, Rabbi. My name is Rick. I'm cousin of Michael and Sandy Sherman.
So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, and an early Hag Pesach Sameach to everyone. I just wanted to introduce a thought from a different perspective.
Yeah.
It's often been asked, why did we wait 40 years at Kadesh Barnea before we were ready to enter Israel? And I learned just recently that only 1/5 of Israel wanted to leave Egypt in the Exodus. So it brings a question to my mind that the majority of us weren't really ready for freedom. And that's a very thought-provoking, issue.
Yeah. Well, what does it take to be ready for freedom, right?
It might take 2 more generations. After 400 years in Egypt, they didn't know what freedom was. It was just an abstraction. And,
yeah.
Maybe they weren't ready. That might have been the reason that we spent 2 generations at Kadesh Barnea.
Because you needed that time. Yeah, but if they hadn't left Egypt, would they have been ready 2 generations later?
Yeah.
Right? And there's actually even some more modern midrashim about Nachshon. So Nachshon jumped into the water, it says, right, in Sota. And some say, well, did he jump in or was he pushed? Right?
Yeah.
Do we need that push? Is it okay to have that push? Are we still ready if we do that?
Yeah, sometimes some people spearhead the push. Yeah. Yeah.
But doesn't it take courage to make a major change in your life? I think we may have discussed that at a Torah study in the past. It really does take courage to, even if you're subjected to terrible things, to get up and go, not knowing where your paths will lead you to freedom. Something like that.
Absolutely. It takes an incredible amount of courage. And that's why if we go back to what Bob was saying, and we go back to what Marla was saying earlier, right? We see things in our world today that are not okay. They're not even remotely okay, right? We see the world around us becoming more and more devastated with wildfires and with pollution and with all sorts of different storms from global warming. We see racism in our midst. We see hatred. We see everything that's going on in Ukraine right now. We see a lot of ills in the world. And to actually make a substantial change, to change our lifestyles, to push back in order to take those pieces of Egypt out of our lives, that's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
I think also about just on Passover, what is the quintessential Passover food?
Matzah.
Matzah, right? All during the week, all during the year. For those of us who eat bread, I understand some of us might have stay away from bread for all sorts of dietary reasons. But bread really is this puffed up thing that takes up space, that takes the space of the container that we give it. And by having matzah, I've taught some of you this before, but the rabbis say on Passover, what do? We deflate our bread. We take out all that fluff. We take out all that arrogance. We take out all of that just this is the way we've always done it, this is the way we always will do it kind of a thing. We flatten the bread so that we can truly think about our assumptions. We can think about what space we're giving to what things in our lives so that we can change the shape of that bread in the future. That's what scarcity and abundance mindset is with Passover, right? It's saying just because it is this way doesn't mean it has to be this way. What can I do in order to break free of the things that are not serving me and my community?
Yeah. Thank you, Rabbi.
No, thank you. That was a great comment bringing in. So any thoughts or comments on any of that? Or do any of you have anything in mind that you're thinking about bringing into Passover this year, whether you're taking part in a community Seder, your own personal practice, a Seder that you're leading? Is there anything in particular that really feels especially relevant and pertinent this year?
Every year, I always find a theme, a different theme. And, one of my favorites is when you remember the TV series Lost was on. And so the entire theme was about being lost, not about the story of Exodus, but the story of what it meant to be lost for so long before we could get into Israel. That all of us have to be lost before we know what school to go to, before we know what career to choose, before we know who the right person is to pick and make decisions. That being lost is so important. That was one of my favorite themes. I'm not sure what's an entryway for quality discussion now. There's so much going on as to making this a theme for this year's, Passover Seder. Does anyone have any suggestions?
Well, before even that, I want to talk about this theme of lost, because I think that's such a fascinating theme, right? Because it pushes back on exactly what we're talking about with abundance and scarcity mindset too.
Right.
That so often in our everyday lives, we can just say, oh, I know the answer to that. I'm sure about this. You're wrong, I'm right, that kind of a thing. And by saying, hey, the Israelites got lost and so should we, so can we, that gives us room to be curious, to explore, to challenge ourselves for the better. That's a really, really cool thing, I think, to bring into our Seders.
And I think it's really relevant in the sense that when we stop and think and really pause, the notion of being lost surfaces. And I think about all the thousands of high school students I worked with, their enthusiasm and excitement at graduation, the pomp, the circumstance, all that stuff, and all the rituals. And when you really set them down individually in the office, they were terrified. They were lost. Yes, many of them had been accepted to their colleges of their choice, but then there were more decisions to make about where to live on campus or not, and what to major in or not. And then there were the other students who really were lost because they hadn't been able to make choices or begin the process of making choices. And so then I think, okay, so you move on to where all of us are today, and the notion of being lost. Sometimes I feel lost. I don't know what to do for someone else. I had to find out what I could do to help Ukraine people, and I was lost. I particularly feel lost when I have someone that I care about who is ill. I feel such at a loss there and lost. But it's the process of reaching out and being there and doing that gets you through it, that answers that question that Bob created and you pursued, Rabbi Cassie, I think. And if you sit around a Seder table, there's loss everywhere. and the feeling of being lost, what to do next. But
Yeah, but what if we turned it around, right?
Yeah.
In our society sends us the message, be sure, know where you're going, know what you're doing. How many of us at any given moment feel completely sure in what it is that we're doing, right? Like, I think if we're honest with ourselves, certainly if I'm honest with myself, sometimes I'm not entirely sure and I'm just kind of making the best call that I can in that moment. And it might be right and it might not be right. The wisdom, I think, in being lost is being able to say, you know, sometimes being lost, it's not about getting through it and getting to the other side. It actually is the greatest gift of all. Just being honest with ourselves that here we are and we're in process, and that is the best place to be. Because if we remember, right, the Torah wasn't given in Israel. The Torah wasn't given in Egypt. Where was it? It was given while the Israelites were lost in the wilderness.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. You know, can I throw one more element into this conversation?
Yeah.
So every culture has a lot of words for the same thing. Like the Greeks had 20 something words for love, and Eskimos have 20 something words for snow. But we have 20 something words for the same thing too. And that's street, highway, avenue, lane, boulevard, freeway, byway, parkway. We're always about being on the path and knowing where we're going.
But sometimes it's just fun to go for a drive.
Yeah. Quick question. How many of you have gone for a drive in the last 2 years, especially during quarantine?
I go for walks. When I feel lost, I go on a hike, which I think is the same kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Well, this is great food for thought. I really appreciate what you've done here with us. And I don't know about the rest of you. This is my favorite holiday of the entire year.
Why?
It's Thanksgiving with a spiritual center that you get to share with your family and friends.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't have to worry about buying gifts. You're right.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
beautiful.
What's Sonia? Say that again, Sonia.
I said that was beautiful.
There's so much depth to Passover. There really is. Aside from the cleaning my house from top to bottom, once I get through that, Passover is also my favorite holiday because it's about being around the table, having conversations of meaning, and taking our tradition and really making it relevant to our everyday lives now.
Yeah.
I love that.
So I know, Bob, we didn't help you come up with a new theme for this year, but I'm curious, does anyone else have anything in particular that you're thinking of bringing into the Seder, whether it's a theme or just something that you've been thinking about? And it's okay if you don't know yet. You have a whole week and a half to figure it out. One thing that I always think about when we come to Passover is when I was a student rabbi. So basically, seminary is 5 years long. And during those years, I served as a student rabbi in very, very tiny congregations in different places. And right before Passover, the very first time as a student rabbi that I'm serving one of these congregations, I get a call right before Passover to go visit a couple of prisoners in a prison right by the temple because they wanted to honor Passover. And I went into the prison And I spent some time with them. I brought them some matzah. And we talked about the meaning of freedom for two people who were in jail and who would be in jail for some time. And we talked about what it could mean, and what they could do even within prison to feel a little more free. The decisions that they can make for themselves, the letters that they could write, the connections that they could foster in order to feel more free at this moment. I can't talk about specifically what we discussed because that wouldn't be appropriate, but just having that conversation, if they could find prison, or if they could find freedom within a prison, how can we find freedom within our everyday lives?
Well, now that's a theme.
Yeah, yeah.
Very eye-opening experience.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm going to run. I'm so glad to see you, and I really appreciate the insights and sharing. Ciao, y'all.
Hi, Bob. See you Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's going to be a special service on Friday, in part honoring our Intro to Judaism class that's been studying together for 6 months now, just about every Sunday morning. So Bob is a part of that. So that's what we'll be celebrating together. Any final thoughts or things that you're thinking about? Yes, Sunny, you just unmuted. Is there something you wanted to say?
I was just going to say so much to think about. And what happened for me is, as a child, I remember Passover. I remember the cleaning of the house, and I remember the preparation, but I also remember the long, long Passover Seder and how we wanted so much for it to be over. But again, thank you for a lot to think about.
The Passover Seder doesn't need to be super long, and it can be really, really fun. There's all sorts of things to bring in to make it really enjoyable. For instance, in my Passover Seder, I come with, and this is good for young children because questions are so important to the Passover Seder. The whole idea is that we engage in conversation, right? We invite people who might not be familiar with the Seder for the specific purpose of not only spending time and being hospitable, but also encouraging questions about everything to do with it, right? And so what I do is I have a huge, huge bowl filled with marshmallows. And anytime anyone asks a question or answers a question, they get a marshmallow thrown at them that they can eat. Not to hurt them, just things like that, right? And we have parsley that's dipped into salt water. That's one of the things that we dip. Well, who said we can't have other things to dip? Because part of the reason that people get frustrated with the Seder is because they're starting to get hungry. It's dinner time. I want to eat, right? Who said that there can't be some vegetables with something to dip into while you're moving into the Seder? One thing that I've done sometimes is something called, what is it called? I can't remember the name of it, but basically it's kind of like acting out the story of the Exodus, not reading it from a book, but actually acting it out. Okay, you're Pharaoh. Okay, you're Moses. Okay, you're God. Play this part up the way that you think it should be played up, and allow people just to have fun with telling it. That can be really fun for kids of all ages, whether you're 1 year old or 101 years old. There's lots of things, right? The Seder definitely has its order, but a Seder was never meant to be just read through a book. It's really a matter of having the things on the Seder plate and maybe even presenting it in a way that people are like, wow, that's really interesting. What's that about? One thing I did with the plagues is crickets are kosher. They're the only bug one of the only bugs that's kosher. So I actually got edible crickets that would be out for people. Now, I had no desire to eat them at all. My son did, but it sure started some conversation around the plagues when those are on the table, right? You could get a glass and put a couple of drops of red food coloring on the bottom so that when you mention the plague of dam, blood at the very beginning, you pour some water and whoa, it just turned to blood. Like all sorts of things just to enliven, just to get people asking questions and in conversation and having fun. I know people who have set their table for Passover so that they arranged it with different tablecloths and stuff. So it actually looks like Israelites walking through the sea. Like with different tablecloths and different clay figures or whatever it is. Like you don't have to go crazy like that, but the idea is just to use imagination and to have fun with it. So if we can do that and we can make it relevant to our lives and we can think deeply about the meanings of Passover, then there's no doubt that this will be a wonderful holiday for all of us. And hopefully not a Seder that we're hoping is over very soon.
Yes.
Robin, my sister one time, I think she went online and she got a script that she printed off, and it was Kermit the Frog, you know, the Sesame Street characters. And they, so the kids, I think we had like a paper towel roll, the cardboard part, that was the microphone. And I think Kermit interviewed us and whatever, the kids could read, you know, it was real easy reading. And that was one of the most fun holidays, Seders that we did. It kind of is more fun when there's the little folks, you know, they come back with what they've learned in school and stuff. And if they haven't done that, then, you know, I remember that there was a couple adults and they sort of resented it. They kind of wanted the esoteric academic part of it. And I felt badly for them because seeing it through the eyes of a child made it for me more meaningful that one year. So yeah, there's some fun things you can do and just go online. Yeah.
And you can have a little of both,
Yes.
right? If you wanted to, you can make it however you want to.
Yeah. Yeah.
But my Seders, like growing up, my family definitely was of the school of let's do it as quickly as possible. But the one year that we acted out the parts, we were going for a long time and no one looked at their watches. So sometimes you could just get lost in it and just have fun. And you don't even realize the time that's kind of ticking by. But whether it's a 30-minute Seder that's meaningful or an hour-long Seder that's meaningful, the point is that we get to just have fun with it and make it a meaningful, wonderful holiday with people that we care about.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here, for adding your insights and thoughts. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what ends up being really profound, what you end up taking away and using to make your Passover really, you know, meaningful and significant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great being with you all.
Thank you. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Leanne. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Linda.
Bye.